The collected short stories of Louis L'Amour. That man from the bitter sands. When Speke came at last to water, he was 2 days beyond death. His cracked lips rustled like tissue paper when they moved, trying to shape a thought. The skin of his face, long burned to a desert brown, had now taken on the patina of crimson. Yet his mind was awake, and alive within him was a spirit that even the desert could not defeat. Without doubt, Ross and Florin believed him dead, and this pleased him, stirring a wry sense of humor. The chirping of birds told him of water before he saw it. His stumbling, almost hypnotic walk ceased, and swaying upon his feet, he turned his head slowly upon his stiff neck. The basin remained unchanged. Only now he had reached the very bottom of the vast depression, and a jagged knife edge of rocks, and an up-thrust from a not too ancient fracture, loomed off to his right. He had seen a dozen such along the line of travel, yet there was a difference. The faint grayish green of the desert vegetation here took on a somewhat deeper green, yet without the birds he might not have noticed. There was water near. Through the heat-engendered haze in his skull there flickered grim humor. Florin and Ross thought that they had taken from him all that promised survival when they had also taken his gold. They had robbed him of weapons, tools, canteen, food, and water. They had left him nothing. Better than anyone else, he had known what lay before him. After they had gone, he had worked to free himself. But when he had succeeded, he did not move away. He waited quietly in the shadow of the ledge, gutted of its small hoard of gold. Only when the sun was down did he move, and when he stepped out with a long space-eating stride, walking away into that vast wasteland shadowed with evening. They had left him two things they did not realize would matter. They had seemed but bits of debris in the looted camp, a prospector's gold pan and a storm square from his canvas ground sheet. Before it grew too dark to travel, he had walked 8 miles. Stopping then, he scooped a shallow hole in the sand and placed it in the gold pan. Over it, he stretched the canvas, and above that he built a small pile of large stones. When his dew sap trap was complete, he lay down to sleep. Scarcely a spoon of water rewarded the effort, yet he swallowed it and was grateful. Before the sun stopped the ridge, he had 3 more miles behind him. Near 2 boulders, he stopped and made a sunshade of a run cedar in the space between the boulders. He crawled into this island of coolness and lay down. Mid-afternoon of the second day, he found a barrel cactus, and cutting off the top, he squeezed some water from the whitish green pulp. On the second and third nights, he also built his dew traps, and each time got a little water. When he first heard the birds, he thought he was losing his reason, yet turning toward the serrated ridge, he stumbled on. At its base, among some desert willows, was a small pool some 4 feet across, but lying in it was a dead coyote. Swaying drunkenly, he stared hollow-eyed at the dead coyote and the poisoned water. He could go no further. He knew he must drink, yet in this weakened state, a case of dysentery would surely kill him. It was not in him to yield, and too well he knew the ways of the wild country and the lessons it taught. The will that had carried him more than 40 miles across the desert moved him then. He dragged the remains of the dead coyote from the water. Then he gathered sticks and built a fire. When he had a small heap of charcoal, he scooped up some water with the gold pan. He covered the water until it was 2 inches thick with charcoal. Then he stoked his fire and waited. Soon the water was boiling. The desert night drew darkness around him. The firelight flickered on the rock wall and upon the fragile boughs of the willow, and the smoke drifted and lost itself in the night. Sparks flew upward and vanished. With a flat stick, he skimmed off the thick scum of charcoal and coagulated impurities. Then he added more charcoal, and the water continued to boil. A second time he skimmed it, and only then did he put some aside to cool. The very presence of water seemed to help. His brain cleared, and he thought. He was now halfway across the vast bowl of desert. He was walking toward a place he knew, a ranch with a well of cool, clear water and a man who would lend him a horse and a gun. Forcing himself to ignore the water, he leaned back against the rocks. His lips rustled together and his tongue felt like a dry stick. He closed his aching eyes and waited out the minutes, listening like a prisoner to the faint trickle of water into the pool. When an hour had passed, he allowed himself his first drink. Dipping up a little of the water, he took some in his mouth and held it there, feeling the coolness bringing life back to the starved, shrunken tissues. Slowly, he let the water trickle down his throat, feeling the delightful coolness all through him. Even that tiny swallow seemed to reach into every part of his body. He bathed his lips and face, then taking his time and finally allowing himself another swallow of the water. Finding in the rock a natural basin that was almost a foot across, he used it as a mold, and with a rounded stone, he carefully pounded his prospecting pan down into it, forcing the pan into a shape more like that of a bucket. Returning to the fire, he boiled more water with the charcoal, then poured it into the basin in the rock, repeating the process with his newly made pail. Adding a few more bits of charcoal, he lay back on the ground and was almost at once asleep, knowing that with the dawn, the water would be clear and sweet. Long ago, he had established a pattern of awakening, and despite his exhaustion, he was stirring long before dawn. It was cold when he opened his eyes, and his body was chilled with the cold of the desert night. Hurriedly, he built a fire and let its warmth permeate his entire being. Then he drank, and after a while drank again. Then he turned to the desert. A fleshy fruited yucca grew near the water hole, and he picked some of the long pods. He ate one of them raw, then roasted the other with some bulbs of the sago lily. When he had eaten these, he took a thin, flat sheet of sandstone and began to dip the water from that hole. Despite the little water there was, it took him more than an hour to empty the hole. From time to time he paused to rest. Once still having his tobacco, he rolled a smoke. He would need no more water than that in his bucket, but if others came along, they would not know of the coyote and the poison spring. He did not know if his actions would help, but a water hole was a precious thing, to be safeguarded by all who passed. When the hole was emptied, he scraped the bottom with his flat stone. Throwing out a huge chunk of the mud, he then enlarged the opening through which the water flowed, still only a mere trickle, and finally sat down to eat more of the pods and bulbs, and to drink more water. Water slowly trickled back into the hole. By night it would be full and rested. He would start on with the first shadows. 3 days later, he was mounted on a horse, and the scabbard on his own borrowed saddle was a Winchester, and thrust into his waistband was a battered but capable Colt. They had insisted he remain and rest, but Speke would have none of it. Florin and Ross had taken his gold, and he had been abandoned to die. Yet it was with no thought of actual revenge that he returned to the desert, nor did he blame his sufferings upon the 2 thieves whom he had taken into his camp when they had been half dead from thirst. The sufferings he had endured, he accepted as he accepted so much else as a part of life in the desert. Yet the gold they had taken was his, and he intended to get it back. Speke was not a big man, but he was tough. The years in the desert had melted away any softness he might have had, and left behind a hard core of that rawhide resilience that the desert demands. Never a gunman, he had used weapons as a soldier in the Apache Wars, as a buffalo hunter, and in his own private skirmishes with desert Mojavs or Pimas. He needed no blueprint to read the plan. In the minds of Florin and Ross, they would go first to Tucson. It was a sufficient distance away. It had whiskey, women, and for a desert town of the era, remarkably good food. On a sunlit morning, not long after daybreak, Tom Speke rode his shambling buckskin into the main streets of Tucson. He rode past staked-out pigs, dozens of yapping dogs, a few casual, disinterested burros, and a few naked Mexican youngsters. He was a lean man of less than 6 feet, not long past 30, but seasoned by the desert. A man with the dingy trousers, a buckskin jacket, a battered narrow-brimmed hat, and a lean-jawed look about him. He swung down at the shoe fly and went into the restaurant. It was a long room of adobe walls washed with yellow, a stamped earth floor, and tables of pine covered with a cheap tablecloth. To Tom Speake, who had sat at a table 4 times in 2 years, the shoe fly represented the height of culture and gastronomic delight. He did not order at the shoe fly. One accepted what the day offered, in this case jerked beef, frijoles, tomatoes, and stewed prunes, and coffee. All but the coffee and the prunes were liberally laced with chili colorados, and there was still some honey that had been brought from Tijuana Ranch below the border. Tom Speake devoted himself to eating, but while he ate, he listened. The shoe fly was crowded, as always, at mealtimes, and there was much talk. Turning to the kid who was clearing tables, he asked if there was any recent news of prospectors striking it rich in the area. The kid didn't know, but a man at the table looked up and put down his fork. "Feller down to the Congress Hall payin' for drinks with dust, says he's made a pile over on the Gila." "Big feller with blonde hair?" A man spoke up from the end of the bar. "Seen him. Looks mighty like a feller from Santa Fe I run into once. They were hunting him for horse stealing." Tom Speake forked up the last piece of beef and chewed it thoughtfully. Then he wiped his plate with a slab of bread and disposed of it in the same way. He gulped coffee, then laid out his dollar and pushed back from the table. The description was that of Florin. The sun stopped him on the step, and he waited until his eyes adjusted themselves to the glare. Then he walked up the street to the Congress. Pausing on the step, he eased the position of the Colt, then stepped inside and moved away from the door. Early as it was, the place was scattered with people. One game gave the appearance of having been on all night. Several men stood at the bar. One of these was a giant of a man in a stovepipe hat and a black coat. Speake knew him for Marcus Duffield, one-time town marshal and now postal inspector, but still the town's leading exponent of gun throwing. Speake glanced around. There was no sign of Ross, but Florin's big blond head was visible. He was sitting in the poker game, and from the look of it, he was winning. Speake moved down to the bar, to the Duffield side. He ordered a drink, then jerked his head at Duffield. "And one for Marcus here." Duffield glanced at him. "Going to be some shooting here, right, Sudden?" Speake said quietly. "I figured to tell you so you wouldn't figure it was aimed at you." He indicated Florin by a jerk of his head. "Feller there, and his partner come into my camp half dead. I gave him grub and water. Second day, they throwed down on me, tied me up, and stole my outfit, including 3 pokes of gold." "Seen the gold," Duffield said. "Didn't figure him for no miner." He glanced over his shoulder. "Better wait until he finishes this hand. He's holding 4 of a kind." Speake lifted his glass and Duffield acknowledged it. They drank, and Tom Speake turned around and they moved down the bar. He waited there, watching the game, his eyes cold and emotionless. Florin raked in the pot on his 4 queens and started to stack the money. And then he looked up and saw Speake. He started to move, then stopped. His eyes stared. His face went sickly yellow. A card player noticed his face, took a quick look at Speake, then carefully drew back from the table. The others followed suit. "You won that hand with my money, Florin," Speake said carefully. "Just leave it lay." Florin took a quick look around. His big hands rested on the arms of his chair, only inches from his gun. One of the players started to interrupt, but Duffield's bold, black eyes pinned the man to the spot. "His show," Duffield said. "That gent's a thief." Florin touched his lips with his tongue. "Now look," he said, "I ain't aiming to kill you," Speake said conversationally. "Nor Ross. You stole my outfit and left me for dead, but all I want is my money and my outfit. Get up easy and empty your pockets." Florin looked at the money and then at Speake. Suddenly his face seemed to set, and an ugly look flared in his eyes. He started to rise. "I'll be double to—" His hands dropped to his gun. Nobody had seen Ross come in the door. He took one quick look, drew, and fired. Even as Speak thumbed back the hammer, he was struck from behind. He staggered, then fell forward. Florin stood, his unfired gun in his hand, and looked down at Speak. Ross held the room covered. Florin lifted the muzzle of his gun toward the fallen man. "Don't do that," Duffield said, "or you'll have to kill every man in this room." Florin looked up at him and hesitated. "Don't be a fool," Ross said. "Pick up your money and let's go." It was 2 weeks before Speak could leave his bed. Despite excellent care by Semig, a Viennese doctor attached to the army, it was a month before he could ride. Duffield watched him mount the buckskin. "Next time don't talk," he advised. "Shoot." Tom Speak picked up the trail of Florin and Ross on the Hasayampa and followed them into Camp Date Creek. Captain Dwyer of the 5th Cavalry listened to Speak's description, then nodded. "They were here. I ordered them out." Ross was known to have sold liquor to the Apaches near Camp Grant. "I couldn't have them around." Swapping the weary buckskin for a zebra-dun Mustang, Speak turned to the trail. At Dripping Springs, Speak drew up and swung down. Cherokee Townsend came from his cabin with a whoop of pleasure. The two once traveled together across New Mexico. In reply to his question, Townsend nodded. "About 2 weeks back," he said. "Didn't take too much to him. Big fellow is riding a bay with 3 white stockings. The other one, an Appaloosa with a splash of white on his right shoulder. They headed for the Prescott." Townsend was, he said, staying on watch for Apaches, he said. "They are out on an about. I buried 27 of them right on this place." Speak rode on. Sparing his horse but holding to the pace, he saw much Indian sign. In Prescott, the two had remained more than a week. They had left town, headed west. Everywhere he was warned of Indians. The Apaches were out, and so were the Hualapais and Mojavs. There were rumors of an impending outbreak at Date Creek, and General Crook was going down to investigate. Neither Florin nor Ross was a man of long experience in the West. During their time in this camp, before they had robbed him, he had seen that. There were men who had come west from Bald Knob, Missouri. Tough men and dangerous, but not desert-wise. On the second day out of Prescott, Speak found 2 Indian ponies, badly used. They had obviously been released by Indians who had gone on with fresher, stronger horses. Speak caught up the 2 ponies and led them along with him, an idea forming in his brain. On the 3rd day, he spotted them ahead of him, and he deliberately created dust off to their left and behind. That night, he left his own horse and rode one of the others and took the other unshod horse around their camp. He left 4 separate sets of tracks across their trail for the following day. Moving on, cat feet, he slipped down to the edge of the camp. A small fire was burning. Florin was asleep, and Ross sat nearby, waiting for more than an hour with Indian patience. He finally got his chance. He slipped the muzzle of his rifle through the strap of a canteen and withdrew it carefully. He could have stolen the other also, but he did not. He made his way some distance, then deliberately let a small gravel slide start. Glancing back, he saw Ross come to his feet and leap from the firelight. It was the beginning of his plan. He watched them draw up when they reached the tracks of the unshod ponies the following morning. To anyone, this certainly meant Indians. Indians often rode horses shod at trading posts or stolen from the white settlers, but white men almost never rode an unshod horse for any length of time. The tracks were headed west and south. Florin and Ross pulled off the trail, working north. Remembering the country ahead of them, Speak was satisfied. In the 4 nights that followed, he succeeded in alarming their camp with stealthy noises at least twice a night. He left pony tracks ahead of them and near the camp. Steadily they bore off to the north, trying to avoid the unseen Indians. They were worried about the Indians they believed were congregating nearby. They had but one canteen between them, and they were getting only disturbed sleep when they slept at all. It was a calculated war of nerves. Twice Speak lay on a bluff or behind a rock near the camp and heard them arguing fiercely. Ahead of them on the following morning, he built a signal fire. He used a blanket to simulate Indian signals. Then went south a few miles and did the same thing. They were now well to the north of Ernberg and headed for Hardyville. At dusk, he lit 2 more signal fires and used the smoke, then put them out and worked closer to the camp of the 2 outlaws. Florin was thinner, haggard, hollow-eyed. Ross was tighter, snappish, and shifty. They built a tiny fire to make coffee, and Speak waited. When Ross reached for the pot, he fired rapidly 3 times. The first shot struck the fire and threw sparks. The second drilled the coffee pot. Speak could see the sudden puff of steam and smoke when the coffee hit the fire, and the third shot struck a log on which Florin was seated. Following the shots, there was silence. Evidently, the firing had caught both men away from their rifles. Moving a little, Speak watched the fire, relaxed and at ease. He had suffered from these men, and now he expected to recover his gold, and to do it, if possible, without killing. Yet they had planned for him to die, and only the presence of Duffield and the rest had saved him in the saloon. It was not a consideration of mercy that moved him, rather a complete indifference to the fate of the 2 men. He wanted his gold. This he had worked for, slaved for. Whatever they had won gambling he would consider his, won with his money in payment for his long trek. Day dawned with low clouds and a hint of rain. He saw them move out slowly and knew they had spent an uncomfortable and altogether miserable night away from their bedrolls. Twice during the day he sent them into hiding with quick shots from ambush, not aimed to kill. Twice he heard them bickering over the canteen, and an idea came to him. He knew they kept the gold close to them, so to get at it was scarcely possible. But there was something else he could get, and that night he stole one of their horses. At dawn, after a quiet sleep on the desert, Tom Speak was awake. Gathering his horses, he left them concealed in the shelter of an upthrust of rock, and then moved closer to watch. Already an argument was ensuing. 1 canteen, 1 horse, 30 pounds of gold, and 2 men. Coolly Speak rolled a smoke. He could have written the story of what was to happen now. Harassed beyond limit, their nerves on edge from constant attack, from sleepless nights, and from uncertainty as to their enemies. The 2 were now facing each other. In the mind of each was the thought that the success and escape could belong to 1 man and 1 man only. Florin was saddling the horse. Then he picked up the gold and tied it behind the saddle. He seemed to be having trouble. Ross dropped his hand to his gun. He failed to calculate on the shadow, and Florin turned and fired. Ross staggered, took a step back, then yelled something, wild and incoherent. He went down to his hands and knees, and Florin swung into the saddle and rode away. Ross remained on his hands and knees. Speak drew deep on his cigarette and watched Florin go. He was heading northwest. Speak smiled and got up. They went back for his own horses. When he had them, he walked down to Ross. The man had fallen, and he was breathing hoarsely. Working with a swift sureness, Speak carried the smaller man into the shade of a cedar and, ripping open his shirt, examined the wound. Ross had been struck on the top of the hip bone, knocking him down and temporarily shocking him into a state of partial paralysis. The bullet had torn a hole in his side, a flesh wound from which blood was flowing. Heating water, he bathed the wound. Then, making a decoction from the leaves of a creosote bush, he used it as an antiseptic on the wound. Then he bandaged it crudely, but effectively. Ross revived while he worked and stared at him. "You? Is it?" "Uh-huh. Figured we lost you." "Ain't likely. Why you helping me?" Speak sat back on his heels. He nodded at the horse he had stolen. "I'm leaving you that horse and a canteen. You head out of here. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you." He got to his feet and started for the horse. Ross stared at him, then tried to lift himself to an elbow. "Managed it." "You leaving me a gun?" "No. Then I'm sitting duck for Injuns. Speak smiled a rare smile. Maybe you'll be lucky. He walked his horse away on Florin's trail. He was in no hurry. Before them lay the breaks of the Colorado. Soon Florin would be stopped by the canyon itself. Speak had been long in the desert, and the desert teaches patience. There was no escape for Florin. For days, Speak had directed his smoke columns and his actions to cause the two outlaws to pull farther and farther north, until now Florin was in a cul-de-sac from which there was no way out except back the way he had come. But Florin would not know this. He would waste time looking. It was a hot, still day when the search ended. A day of a high sun and the reflecting heat from the face of vast plateaus of rock and the cedar-clad hillsides. Lizards panted even in the shade, their mouths held open, their sides pumping at the hot, thin air. Florin was hollow-eyed and frightened. Whichever way he went, he faced canyons, and the only water was far, far below. Only a few drops sloped lonesomely in his canteen, and the horse he rode was gaunt and beaten. He swung down, and his heels hit hard, and he stared over the brink into the vast canyon below. Trapped. 7 times he had found new routes, and each had ended in a cliff. 7 times he had tried, and 7 times he failed. And now he knew there was no way to turn but back. He turned toward the horse, and if expecting him, the animal went to its knees, then rolled over on its side. Fiercely, Florin swore. He kicked the horse. It would not rise. It could not rise. Better yet, without the horse, he could take the gold and find a way down the cliffs. Then a raft. Feverishly, he rushed at the horse and stripped off the pack of gold. He started to take his rifle, then shrugged it. It would only be in the way. Shouldering the gold, he walked to the cliff. There was no way over at that point. He turned, then stopped abruptly. 100 yards away was Speak. The prospector held a Winchester cradled in his arm. Speak said nothing. He just stood there, silent, still, alone. Florin touched his lips with his tongue. He held the gold sack in his right hand. Anyway, at that range, a pistol. He looked toward his rifle. Too far away. Speak shot from the hip, and the sack jerked in Florin's hand. Another shot. Speak moved a step forward, and Florin dropped the sack and drew. He fired quickly, hastily. He missed. Speak fired again, and Florin felt the bullet tug at his shirt. He took a hasty step back, then fired again himself. The bullet struck far to the left. Speak swung his rifle and fired. Rock fragments stung Florin's cheek. He jerked his head back up. Speak said nothing. He worked the lever on his rifle and waited. Florin started forward, and a bullet kicked up sand ahead of him. He took a hasty step back. The edge could not be far behind. He glanced back at Speak, fired swiftly, 3 shots. They scattered rock around his feet, and ricocheted, burned Florin's face. He was no more than 6 feet from the edge. "You ain't going to make me jump," he shouted angrily. He threw up his gun and fired. Speak waited a minute, then walked swiftly forward and picked up the gold. He backed away, then dropped the sack and fired. His Winchester 73 carried 11 bullets, and he was counting them. The shot whipped by Florin's face so close it drew blood. Florin was frightened now. His face was drawn and white. He stared with the wide eyes and haggard mouth. Speak picked up the gold again and backed to his horse. Lashing it behind the saddle, he swung into the leather. As he did so, he dropped the lead rope of one of the Indian ponies. "Help yourself," he said, and rode slowly away. Florin started after him, shouting. Tom Speak did not turn his head or glance back. He merely rode on, remembering Tucson and the shoe fly. He would enjoy a meal like that now. Maybe in a week or so. He had lots of time.